last week's unit, we were talking about the Age of Industrialization. We were talking about Europe and specifically Great Britain being the leader in industrializing. Now, one of the effects of the industrial era is that there's this sudden need for new resources, for raw materials. And because Europe has kind of blown ahead of the rest of the countries, they're going to start looking for other places that they can pull these resources. Now, if you guys remember back to the Age of Exploration, where Great Britain is reaching over to what would become the United States, into Canada, you have people competing over the New World for resources, for people to rule, for territory. This is basically going to come back into play. This is going to be the next play moving forward. They're going to start reaching out and trying to take over new countries, new territories for their own benefit. So we're going to introduce the Age of Imperialism. Okay, so what this is essentially countries looking for territories and colonies that they can pull resources from. The first topic that we're going to cover today is going to be the scramble for Africa. This is essentially when Europe decided that they wanted to take over and take as many of the resources from Africa as possible, and they were competing to see how much land they could take. And the Africans didn't get any say. They tried to fight back, but again, Europe was so advanced at that time period that it really wasn't a competition. There's only one example of a country being able to successfully fight off Europeans. So let's talk about the causes here. So, like we said, industrialization is going to kind of lead to imperialism. It's this need for resources, need for new markets as well, because you can process and produce a certain amount of goods, but you always want to expand who you're selling to. The more people you can sell to, the more profit you can make, the more you can produce, the better goods, et cetera, et cetera. It's kind of a cycle. Now, everyone is going to start looking for less developed nations, places that didn't have the kind of resource or that didn't have the manufacturing and ability to produce certain goods. Because if they can't produce it, there's a need there. If there's a need, you can supply them and basically make a new market for yourself. Let's talk about the Congo first. So King Leopold II of Belgium is going to exploit the Congolese and try to make as much money as possible. He's going to essentially abuse the people that are there for his own exploits. They're going to be using them to garner resources and things like that. And there's this kind of superiority that Europeans tend to have when dealing with the natives, where if they don't meet a certain requirement, if they don't collect a certain amount of goods, there's vicious and brutal punishments. We're talking about physical beatings. You're talking about sometimes, in extreme examples, taking off body parts, ears, noses, things like that. Well, the Belgians are going to come in and take over this area and set up what would be called the Belgian Congo, right? So it's no longer regular Congo. Now, there's going to be this kind of national pride that's going to come out of it. It's this idea of national superiority in a way. The Europeans recognize that they are far better developed than a lot of these countries. Well, the idea that all of these Europeans seem to be so ahead of the pack is going to give them, again, a superiority complex. You tie this in with the kind of racial aspects back from slavery into Africa, well, it's kind of going to mix together. You have countries that believe that they're better because they're more developed, and they're also going to look at these Black Africans and think that they are racially superior. You combine that together, and it's basically going to be a concoction for vicious oppression of these native people, right? Just because they don't have the technology, just because they don't have the kind of formalized government that Europeans do, they're seen as lesser. The idea of social Darwinism, the idea that some races are just inferior to others, that they're born inferior. Later on, you're going to see people substantiate this with fake science, talking about cranium size and brain size. Like, oh, Africans have smaller brains, so they're like dumber or something like that. It's basically they were trying to find any reason why it was okay to take over these countries, because obviously it looks bad. You can't just step into a country, say you're a lower being than me, and take over without somebody questioning that. Well, if you have science behind you, or you have this social stigma that Africans are a lesser people, well, then it's substantiated, at least in the eyes of Europeans. Now, you have Cecil Rhodes here, who is going to be he's going to be one of the kind of administrators in Africa, and he's going to be talking about the differences between whites and blacks, essentially. So if we read the quote here, I contend that we Britons are the first race in the world. The more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race. It is our duty to seize every opportunity of acquiring more territory, and we should keep this one idea steadily before our eyes, that more territory simply means more of the Anglo-Saxon race, more of the best, most human, most honorable race the world possesses. Again, this is straight out of every white supremacist book. In fact, Cecil Rhodes is going to be such a significant character that they're going to name one of the territories after him. It's going to be called Rhodesia. Now, it's kind of a weird concept where Rhodesia is filled with Africans, with black Africans, and it's named after a white guy that thinks that black people are inferior. It's kind of a weird way that works out. And that was it for a long time. Rhodesia was a country, for dozens and dozens of years. It went on for a long time. One of the interesting things, too, is that Cecil Rhodes is going to go on to establish De Beers Diamond Company, which is, even today, one of the largest exporters of diamonds straight out of Africa. So Britons went in there to take resources. They found out that some of these countries had a large supply of these kind of rare metals, rare earth kind of resources, and they've been exploiting it ever since. Again, De Beers is the entire reason why diamonds are worth anything. They limit the amount of supply that goes out of Africa, and that's why even the cheapest diamond that you buy from any jewelry store is going to be thousands of dollars. Diamonds in reality are completely worthless. That's why we use them with mining and stuff. But if you limit the amount of supply, you can hike up the price. Now, Europe has this technological superiority. They have firearms. They're going to have vehicles moving forward. They're going to have the steam engine, and they're able to move goods all over the place. Now, there's kind of this benefit that's going to occur later where they're going to start introducing these technologies into these colonies, which is going to develop them, but there's still the suppression that's going to happen, keeping them from developing any further, or basically stymieing them from reaching the point of the Europeans. Now, one of the big things is Africa has a lot of tribes at this time, and these tribes are natural enemies. They fight against one another, so it was really easy for them to pit people against them. All they needed to do, if they had somebody that didn't want to give up a certain territory, they would go and offer firearms or money or something like that to a rival tribe. Well, now you've just made an ally. Well, as soon as you take over one tribe, do you think they're going to stay loyal? Probably not. So it was a lot of backstabbing that's going on with the Europeans. Now, at some point, the Europeans decide that they need to stop fighting over territories because they realize if everybody is taking over Africa, that there's going to be fighting between Europeans. And that's not what it's all about. It's about dividing this country up so that they can pull resources from it without the Africans' say. So they have the Berlin Conference. This is where they're going to meet up and basically draw the lines of which territories they take. The Europeans' plan, take as many raw resources as possible, bring it back to their country, produce goods, and then you can sell it back to Africa. You can sell it to other countries. All of this is basically making Europeans money and suppressing the native Africans. Here's the picture of Africa right when imperialism is starting versus after the meeting. So this is the picture on the right here is right before World War I breaks out. If you look, only a couple of areas were really owned at this time period by other countries. Right? You have the French taking a couple places, the Boers, which are the Dutch, and you're going to have the British taking South Africa. Well, once this meeting, the Berlin Conference happens, then all of Africa is split up. Ethiopia, in fact, is the only place that successfully staves off the Europeans. They happen to be strong enough, they happen to be modernized enough, and they had that kind of willingness to die for their cause. They were one of the few places that was structured and organized like or closer to a European place with the military capabilities to fend them off. It wasn't until later into the 30s where they even fell to a European power, but that's for another day. Okay. Let's talk about South Africa for a little bit. So there's going to be three groups that are trying to stave claim over South Africa. You have the Zulus, which are the natives, and there's a couple of other tribes, but they're really the big ones. The Boers, which are the Dutch, and then the British. Now, the Zulus were there first, and they're going to be fighting against colonialization from the British. Now, this is kind of the big fight, and there's stories of Zulus, of Shaka Zulu, which people have probably heard of from pop culture and things like that. He was the leader at the time, and there's British stories where the Zulus were such hardened fighters that they were willing to run into machine gun fire, and it terrified the British. They were willing to literally take on bullets, and they'd see their allies falling around them, but they would still be charging them. It was almost like they thought they were bulletproof. And it was a bloody massacre in a lot of these fights just because the Zulus were using swords, or were using spears and shields, and the British had early machine guns. And although the British didn't have as many people, they still had the firepower to overwhelm them. The second group is going to be the Boers. Now, the Boers had been there for a long time. We're talking about turn of the century, right before the 1900s. And the Boers, the Dutch, had settled in South Africa 300, 250 years ago. Okay, we're talking about the same amount of time that the United States has been around. So the Dutch, the Boers, had been living in South Africa, and we would almost kind of consider them Africanized people. They were living there, they had set up this colony, but the British are going to want to fight them. So this is going to end up leading to what's called the Boers War. This is the conflict kicking the Dutch out and trying to get complete and total control over what we would consider South Africa today. Now, there's kind of an interesting character that we'll see appear from the Boer War, and that is Sir Winston Churchill. This is going to be one of his earliest military campaigns where he's going to garner some kind of significance in British politics. Now, Winston Churchill is going to become important later because he's going to become I believe it's the Navy Admiral for the British, and then he'll work his way up in the military and then eventually become Prime Minister during World War II. But again, story for another day.